Preface to the paperback edition. The world was very different when we finished editing the text of the hardcover edition of Trade Wars Are Class Wars in January 2020. The Chinese and US governments had just agreed their Phase 1 trade deal to end the escalating tariff conflict that had begun in 2018, with the Chinese side promising to increase purchase of American goods and agreeing to open up parts of its financial system to American companies. European governments were focused on negotiating the next 7-year European Union budget. Negotiations made all the more contentious by the recent departure of the United Kingdom, even as they prepared for a coming trade clash with the United States over issues ranging from taxes imposed on American internet giants to how to address climate change. Reports of a new respiratory disease in Wuhan were only just starting to emerge, yet the coronavirus proved to be the defining event of 2020. Millions of people died, while many survivors have suffered long-term organ damage. The global economy went through an unprecedented convulsion as workers and consumers tried to avoid getting infected, with business activity falling 20 to 30% in a few weeks. And the government across much of the world responded to the shock of the pandemic with measures previously used only in wartime. In that context, an explanation of trade conflicts and financial imbalances might have seemed somewhat less important. But while we certainly did not anticipate the pandemic, recent events have reinforced the importance of the points we made in this book. The pandemic has exacerbated many of the existing distortions in income, saving, and spending we highlighted, leading to surging debt and widening trade imbalances across much of the world. It was also a reminder that everyone is connected, whether we like it or not. Pollution, climate change, and highly contagious respiratory viruses have no respect for national borders. Countries that have succeeded in suppressing the virus have been forced to cut themselves off from the rest of the world to an unprecedented degree, and even then have been forced to react aggressively to prevent recurring outbreaks from turning into the devastating waves seen in America and Europe. A key point of this book is that the financial and economic imbalances that originate in one part of the world are also transmitted globally, linking groups as various as Chinese migrant workers, German pensioners, and American construction workers in subtle and often surprising ways. What might seem like a purely domestic affair in one country often ends up affecting people in the rest of the world through changes in the balance of payments. Tellingly, the places that have protected their populations from the disease itself have had much less success protecting their businesses and workers from the economic fallout. Between the end of 2019 and the end of 2020, business activity had dropped about as much in South Korea as in the United States, for example. While many people increasingly appreciate that the public health and the environmental protection require global cooperation, fewer realize that the same logic applies to everything from labor standards to corporate taxation. But another way, if a virus can upend the world, why not China's banking system or the investment practice of German businesses? Everyone in the world has an interest in preventing future pandemics, even if that means getting involved in the internal affairs of other societies. This book argues that the same reasoning applies to economic and financial crisis. Unfortunately, while the coronavirus is already passing because of the rapid discovery and distribution of effective vaccines, the social and political conditions that preceded it are not. That brings us to one of the central points of our book. In any country, the distribution of income has economic and financial consequences both internally and abroad, with rising inequality leading to some combination of a lower spending on goods and services and higher debt. The global concentration of income over the past several decades was responsible for slower growth in living standards in much of the rich world, worsening trade imbalances, and the global financial crisis. In many societies, the virus has exhibited these pre-existing inequalities, with lower income workers more likely to lose their jobs, more likely to get sick, and less likely to own the stocks and houses that have appreciated so much in value. The virus also has had unequal economic effects across countries. Oil exporters were hammered by the collapse in energy prices, while countries that manufactured advanced electronics did relatively well as consumers and businesses shifted to working from home. At least as important as these structural differences, however, were the differences in how governments responded to the virus according to their political and social institutions. Some, such as the United States, gave trillions of dollars directly to workers and consumers with economic impact payments and major enhancements to the unemployment insurance system, while others, such as China, instead offered subsidized loans to financial infrastructure spending by local governments and intervened in the currency markets to support exporters. These were not discrete national responses by the United States and China. Both sides of policies had a substantial impact on the rest of the world because both countries are part of the broader connected system. The Chinese government's reluctance to support its own consumers meant that it was effectively depending on foreign consumers to preserve Chinese jobs and incomes, an approach that worked only as well as it did because the U.S. government was aggressively sending money to American consumers without limiting where and how to spend it. China's response would have had very different implications for the Chinese and global economies had the U.S. responses been different, and the same is true for the United States. The different approaches meant that even though both countries experienced similar economic downturns when the virus first hit, their recoveries looked radically different. Those differences were reconciled through shifts in trade and finance. While the virus originated in China, the central government's aggressive response more or less eliminated by its March. After a sharp shutdown in business activity in January and February, virtually every economic indicator quickly rebounded by the spring. Although tens of thousands of newly jobless migrant workers were forced to retreat to the countryside to live as subsistence farmers. Much of Chinese society returned to something like a normalcy by the summer. Yet China's economic recovery was profoundly uneven. While total economic output was 2.3%, higher across all of 2020 than all of 2019, consumer spending on goods other than groceries and fuel was 3% lower than in 2019, and spending at restaurants was 17% lower. Offsetting the drop in household consumption was a surge in residential construction, up 8%, infrastructure investment up 5%, and manufacturing exports up 4%. It makes for a striking contrast to the United States, which completely failed to limit the spread of the virus. Unlike in China, America's domestic air travel never recovered, while restaurants' traffic never came close to returning to the pre-pandemic norm in most of the country. Yet even though the U.S. economy shrank by about 3.5% in 2020 compared to 2019, consumer spending on goods, excluding groceries and gasoline, was 4% higher. Similarly, residential construction spending was up almost 10%. The magnitude of the U.S. government's fiscal and monetary response meant that despite the pandemic, many Americans had much more cash than ever before in their lives. While many people chose to pay down credit card debts and put more money in their checking accounts, they also used the extra money to boost their spending on cars, appliances, and home renovations. But American manufacturing production was 6% lower in 2020 than in 2019, while exports were down by 16%. To oversimplify only slightly, both the Chinese government and the American consumers, the latter financed by the U.S. federal government, supported the Chinese producers even as Chinese consumers cut their spending at the expense of foreign manufacturers. The net effect was a massive increase in American trade deficit that was almost perfectly matched by a massive increase in China's trade surplus. If the United States and the rest of the world had responded to the economic impact of COVID-19 as China did, the likeliest outcome would have been a surge in global unemployment, with a particularly severe downturn in China itself. When the world suffers a sudden drop in demand for goods and services, policies that encourage additional production are effective only if those measures are balanced out by other countries instead choosing to support additional consumer spending. The pandemic widened the existing economic and financial imbalances within and between China and the United States. But more positively, it may have also marked the beginning of a rebalancing among the major European countries. As of the beginning of 2021, the notoriously tight-fisted German government has pledged to provide almost as much direct support to its citizens as that given in the United States, and just over 4 times as much aid as have been offered by the government of Spain relative to the size of its economy. Well, it is unfortunately that many European governments, particularly Belgium, France, Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, have felt limited in what they can do to protect their consumers and the businesses from the economic shock. It is noteworthy and encouraging that the German political class has been willing to act so aggressively in response to this crisis. It makes a serious contrast from their behavior in the past several decades and may perhaps be the start of a more enlightened approach to economic policy making. One immediate consequence was that the German spending on imports from the rest of the world fell by less than foreign spending on German exports, with the net effect subtracting about 1.1% points from total domestic production in 2020. In Italy, where the government was unable to spend nearly as much, imports fell far more than exports, with the resulting shift in the trade balance boosting national income by almost 1% from what it otherwise would have been. Even more consequential is that the leaders of the European Union's 27 member states, led by the German government, agreed to have the European Commission borrow up to €750 billion on their behalf and spend some of the money on collective relief efforts. While the amounts are small relative to the magnitude of the damage from the coronavirus, the agreement is significant because it marks the first time that the European heads of government have agreed to borrow jointly for common projects. If it works and becomes a precedent, the creation of the Recovery and Resilience Facility could prove to be the beginning of the European Union's transition to something greater than the sum of its parts. Instead of never-ending conflicts over money between North and South, East and West, Europeans would finally have the means to transcend their differences and make all of their residents better off. That brings us to the other main point of our book. Prosperity is not a scarce resource. Societies do not succeed at the expense of others, because everyone is connected through trade and finance. More production and more consumption are ultimately better for everyone. China's revival after the end of Maoism did not require the disposition of the American middle class. Just as the liberation and reintegration of Central and European Europe into the West did not force workers in France, Germany, and Italy to endure lower wages, higher joblessness, and higher debt. Rather, those were consequences of choices made across the world by the rich, by the companies they control, and by the political leaders they influence. The perverse result of those choices is that we as a species have been living below our means for decades, shrinking the world's economic pie, even as more and more people have become convinced that they must personally suffer to remain competitive in global markets. The good news is that these arguments have been gaining traction since this book first appeared in May 2020. Whether it is the Dutch central banker who warned that working people are getting an increasingly smaller piece of the economic pie and called for reforms that give households more room to spend so that they can boost imports and reduce their trade impulses. The Chinese government officials who are calling for demand-side reform to redistribute more income to workers, or the new U.S. president who campaigned on supporting American manufacturers not through tariffs but through additional government spending, there seems to be a growing sense that the pandemic political economy consensus can and should be revised. We hope that the release of this paperback edition helps to spread the ideas further. Okay, finished reading this preface.